we can introduce our guests today. We've got Shelby Tisdale, PhD, and I'm going to introduce Shelby first, and she's going to introduce Federico. So we appreciate both of you joining us today for this exciting presentation. I think the anthropology side of you, anybody anthropology lovers out there will really be interested in this presentation of a place that's near and dear to my heart in Oaxaca, Mexico. And we greatly appreciate both of you for joining us today. Shelby Tisdale received her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Arizona, woohoo, in 1997. She received her BA from the University of Colorado Boulder, where she studied anthropology and archaeology, and her MA from the University of Washington, where she majored in social anthropology and museum studies. Dr. Tisdale is the director of the Center of Southwest Studies at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. She's the former vice president of exhibitions and curatorial at the Autry Museum of American West in Los Angeles, and was the director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture Laboratory of Anthropology in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She has served as a museum director, curator, and consultant for more than 40 years. In addition to being an award-winning author, and she's published over 40 articles and book chapters related to American Indian art and culture, repatriation, and women in the West. And she contributed to this book. The University of Arizona Press presents Federico Jiménez Caballero, author, jewelry artist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. So thank you for joining us, Shelby.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be joining you today. And I do want to thank the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for giving us the opportunity to present this new book, Federico, One Man's Remarkable Journey from Tututepec to Los Angeles to LA. And this book was published by the University of Arizona Press, and we certainly want to just share our appreciation for everyone at the press that we worked with, Allison Carter in particular, who took a real interest in the possible publication of this book. I'm going to start I'm going to do a quick presentation, and then I'm going to turn it over to Federico. And first of all, I thought I would just share with you a little bit of how Federico and I met and how we started working together on this book. I started working at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in 2005. And the International Folk Art Market, which is held annually, is pretty much held right in front of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the International Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe. And I had, in 2006, I had just published a book called Fine Indian Jewelry of the Southwest, the Millicent Rogers Museum collection. And I mentioned Federico in this book. And when I learned that Federico is going to be at the International Folk Art Market, I reached out to him and gave him a couple of copies of the book for him to share with family members and so on. And the reason I mentioned him in the book was because when he was serving on the Millicent Rogers Museum board in the 1990s, they discovered sketches of some jewelry that Millicent Rogers had done. And the board, the director of the museum and the board asked Federico and his brother if they would recreate jewelry based on these designs that could be sold in the gift shop at the Millicent Rogers Museum. And so that's why I mentioned Federico in the book. From that time moving forward, I would see Federico every year at the International Folk Art Market, and he also participates in the Santa Fe Indian markets. And he started telling me that he was writing his memoirs in Spanish. And so we just started talking about possibilities. And in 2012, I moved to Los Angeles to take up the vice president position at the Autry, what was called the Autry National Center at the time, to work on a major exhibition. And Federico was on the board of trustees and still serves on the board of trustees of the OTRI. And it gave me more of an opportunity to learn about Federico, but also about his life. And oftentimes we would have dinner together in Santa Monica with his lovely wife, Ellen, and he would tell me stories of his life growing up. And I was just taken with the challenges that he had to face as a child and as a teenager, and even after moving to the United States. The other thing that I thought his story really revealed to me was a time period in Oaxaca that we know very little about in terms of anthropology and ethnology. And so I thought this story also could serve as a story that could help young people in particular who are struggling with similar kinds of situations, but also as a good scholarly book that could be used in university classes. So it serves kind of a double purpose. So when Federico asked me to work on his book with him, I just couldn't do it at the time because I was an employee at the OTRI. And with his position on the board, there was a conflict of interest. So it wasn't until 2015 when I decided to retire and move back to Santa Fe that when the announcement went out to the board of trustees that I was retiring, Federico called me and asked if I could work on his book, and it was perfect timing. So we started out, he took me to Oaxaca before I moved back to Santa Fe, and he showed me all the places that he talks about in his story. And it allowed me to have a better insight to his life in his stories. And so as the editor of this book, it gave me the opportunity to also ask him specific questions about places so we could fill in more of the story. And a little later on, a couple of years ago, I was able to visit Tututepec, his birthplace, when I was traveling with some friends. And so I got familiar also with that. And all of these travels helped me to really provide more insight and help with Federico's book. The book itself is divided into actually 4 parts. There's a beginning where there's just an introduction about his ancestors and his heritage, and I'm going to explain a little bit about that. And then part 1, this is when his story really starts. In childhood is his time in Tututepec as a child. Part 2 is coming of age in Oaxaca City, and part 3 is finding my way, and it's about his life in the United States. So now I'm just going to give you just a quick brief overview of his heritage. And also for some of you who may never have traveled to Oaxaca, Oaxaca is a state in southern Mexico. And the Mixtec area is pretty much this large area right here. These are all people who speak a form of the Mixtec language. There are other indigenous cultures in this area as well who speak different languages. But what we're going to be focusing on today primarily is Tututepec, which is here located very close to the Pacific coast. And for those of you who have traveled to Oaxaca, you might know where Puerto Escondido is. It's a little hidden down here, but it's very close to Tututepec. And then this will be the first part of his story. And then the second part is going to take place here in Oaxaca City. So I just wanted to show you this little map so you'd have a frame of reference of where we're talking about. So first of all, Federico is descended from the Mixtec, and the Mixtec is an indigenous group and speaks one of the 16 native languages that are spoken in Oaxaca today. He is descended from the coastal Mixtec, and the present day town of Tututepec, where Federico was born, was built on the pre-Hispanic pyramids and temples of the capital of the ancient Mixtec kingdom of Yucutza. that dates to the post-classic period of AD 1100 to about 1522. And if you travel to Tututepec today, there is a small museum there. It's an archaeology museum. The other thing about Tututepec, it is a very, very coastal town. And at the time that Federico was growing up in Tututepec, there were no roads going into the city or the town. There is now a paved road going in, but at the time there were no paved roads, and the airport was actually the planes would land in a field, and so it was not a real contemporary town at that time. The one thing about Tututepec is it is mentioned in the codices, and it remained independent at the time of the Spanish conquest in 1522, and it became the first Spanish capital in Oaxaca. It only lasted about 2 years, and the Spanish just couldn't stand the heat and the humidity and the mosquitoes and ended up moving the capital to the current location of Oaxaca City. So that gives you just a little insight into his Mixtec culture. One of the things that the Mixtec were famous for is their mastery in the arts, especially metalworking, jewelry, textiles, and decorated pottery vessels. They also had extensive trading networks. They also had a class structure that included the hereditary rulers, who were the caciques, hereditary nobles, which were the principales, and the commoner class. And Federico is descended from the noble class. So now I would like to turn it over to Federico. He's going to tell you his story. Federico is a well-known philanthropist and entrepreneur in Los Angeles today. And his journey is a fascinating journey of how he got to this place in his life. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Federico.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Shelby, for your presentation, and thank you to the University of Arizona Press for publishing my book. It was very important for me to publish this book for mostly children of the village, young people, and old people, so they would know what is the life of a child, mystic child in the village. When I'm going to go to my village in this moment, and I will describe how I found my village when I was being raised there. They was very divided, thanks to the Spanish and the prejudice that took place in the colonization. All the Indians were in barrios around the village. The principales were about 8 or 9 principales and had to do with each section of the barrios. They have to manage and to see all the problems and customs of the community and each principal. So my grandfather was a principal. So the mestizos were in the center of the village, and of course, I said the Indians around, and there were markers. The Indians couldn't buy land, and the mestizos and vice versa. There were 2 rivers or 2 places where the mestizos went to wash their clothes and bathe, and the Indians have their own river where they used that for bathing and washing clothes also. And there were 2 cemeteries, one for Indians and one for mestizos. In the church, the Indians were in the back and the mestizos in the front. There was no intermarriage between mestizos and Indians. And my mother was one of the ones who broke that rule. And of course, she pays a lot of the consequences of it. My mother married my father, so I'm Indian, and my mother was mestiza, so I'm a product of 2 ethnic groups. After my mother married my father, she got pregnant with 1 child, and there was no much appreciation for my mother because she didn't know how to make tortillas. She didn't know how to grind corn. She didn't know how to weave. She didn't know how to kill an iguana and cook it. So my father's side, they were very sure they will accept my mother or no. Anyway, she got pregnant and my grandfather was waiting for the grandson because my uncles were not interested in being the principal, the oldest one. And besides, he has only 2 children and they were female. So there was no way to continue the line. So my grandfather was waiting for a grandson to be born. And the last hope was my father, the youngest one. So my mother got pregnant, and when the baby was born, died, birth. So kind of frustrated for my grandfather and my father that the baby wasn't born alive. So she got pregnant again, and then also died at birth. So my grandfather was so outrageous that he called some shamans and healers to study what happened, why this baby died. So they arrived there and they studied the circumstances, the environment, and the health of my mother. And they found out that everything was okay. And they delivered the findings to my grandfather that my mother at birth killed the babies because she didn't want to mix the mestizo blood with the Indian blood. Oh God, that was really very bad news for my grandfather and for the whole family and the community. So my mother wanted to come back to her father, and her father said to come back and she will be married immediately to one of the bodyguards. My mother's father was the most powerful man in the village. Also, he was very rich, but didn't appreciate that my mother made an Indian. So my mother continued, and the situation was very bad for my mother, kind of toxic environment. And she was waiting what to do, not to come back to her father and to stay there. So then she got pregnant again. So my grandmother was a healer also, curandera. And she and my aunt watched my mother like a hawk every day, every moment. So a week before she had the baby, my grandfather called the shamans and the healers to be there so my mother wouldn't kill the baby or something to that effect. So they were hosted in a dark house that I remember the house. And when my mother started feeling the pains, about 3 o'clock in the morning, the shamans went and started doing the ceremonies for me to get out of it, to this world. And my mother begged my father to bring a midwife. So when the midwife arrived there, the house was full of incense burning, the copal, and everybody, all the shamans were chanting. My mother said that they didn't speak any Spanish, and they have the fire and threw salt to the fire, and the fire was cracking, and studying the cracking of the fire and the sky with stars and the weather, everything. But the most important shaman was the tonero, they call in the village. The tonero is a guy, a shaman who drinks teas, hallucinating himself to transform him in a shaman. And he's provided with a comal, we call comal, where they make tortillas. The comal is a piece of clay. So the shaman sprayed ashes in the comal. With the stick, he was drawing all kinds of animals from the region in order to find my tona. And when I screamed the first time in my life when I got out of my mother's tummy, that animal that the shaman was drawing, that was going to be my other eye, my spiritual guide. And I was going to be with my Tona all my life and vice versa. So I was born fine, healthy, and my grandfather was very happy. He was told what my Tona was. And then my uncle went to the square and got the dozens of fireworks to announce in the community that the boy was being born in the family. I was all the attention for all the people that my grandfather had in control as the principal. But the problem was that my grandfather didn't have the time to prepare me. And he died when I was 3 years old. So my mother and my grandmother stayed in the house. My uncles got married and went away. So there was a big fight all the time, this clash of culture between my mother, mestiza, and my grandmother, Indian. And I remember my mother used to very often told my grandmother, you are made out of wood, you still won't be good enough for me. And so the fighting went on and on and on. And the time when my brain started recording my life was one afternoon that was probably almost 6 years old. And my grandmother says to me, let's go and talk to the gods. She grabbed me from my hands and we walked to this little hill. I remember it was sunset, and she was carrying some little dolls made of clay, ugly little dolls, and a piece of textile. And when we got to the hill, she put it in the ground, and she put some corn seeds also that she buried in the soil. And then she started talking to the gods. And I remember the scenery was the most extraordinary scenery that in Tututepec, because it was the village, it's a hill town, and then there was the wonderful green valley of the village, and then the wonderful lagoon of Chakawa, and then the ocean. So, and was sunset, very radiant sunset, if I remember. And my grandmother started praying, not praying, she never said, let's pray, she said, talk. So she was talking to the gods, she started very softly, and then she started screaming until she cried. And when I saw her crying, I cried myself. And then when she finished, she cleaned my tears with her hands, and we walked to the house. And when we got to the house, my mother was enraged. She said, why are you doing that to my son, and you're witching? They started, fighting. So my mother used to take me to church for service. And one day I saw this Christ in the church with these very big eyes, carrying a cross or bleeding in the face. And I look at the Christ, and in front of me, he was looking at me. And then I went on my left side, and he was looking at me. I went on the right side, and he was looking at me. And I said, Mother, he wants to talk to me. Oh, Mother, look, he's following me. And he started laughing and laughing and laughing. And the church was, always packed. And then somebody said, get that evil out of the church. It's interrupting us. And I was laughing and laughing. And when I got out of the church, my mother beat me and said to me, you behave like an Indian. You behave like an Indian. So she always was punishing me for that reason. So I was a little bit over 6, and my grandmother died, and I never went back to the little hill at sunset. So there was only my father and my mother, and they started selling everything that my grandfather left, and a couple of cows, a couple of mules, and some pigs. And so I remember that suddenly poverty arrived at home. And the people, the neighbors who came to visit my mother, so that we became very poor, and because the principales, they support the community that they control, they support the principal, they bring vegetables, chickens, and meats, and whatever they, beans, whatever they have. That is a tradition that the principal has to be provide with all those things, you know. So people was saying to my mother, you don't have money and you're poor, but this house is a nice house with adobe house with painted with white and tile roof, and you know. And then my mother said, yes, I'm going to eat the house because it's the only thing that, well, being a principal, my grandfather has to have a house that way, you know. So the only mare that was left, we went to Juquila in the fair to sell it, which I describe in the book. And after that, I only have one donkey and a little piece of land that my grandfather left. So I went there to cut. I was 8 years old when I started working, and I cut hay to sell it in the square town for 10 centavos a bunch. And we have very little money to survive and to eat. And my mother was very embarrassed to ask her family for help, and she always was that way. So anyway, whatever she made beaded blouses, and I went to in the community in the village. I sold them to business people, and whatever she made, I went and sold them, and she sent me to the mill to grind the corn so she could make tortillas. And making me doing things that the girl should be doing. So all the kids were bullying me, and my mother didn't have anybody. My mother didn't want to do herself, you know, because she never left the house. And she always went to visit people at night. So the bully was terrible. And I just didn't do anything. I didn't have any alternative but to continue that life, working and working. So I wasn't really a very happy child. So, for example, sometimes to see something different, I went to the atrium of the church and I rang the bells for the councilmen to come to the city hall, and they came, and there was a fake call. And sometimes I rang the bell for somebody was dead in the community, and they went to church and was a fake call. And I was just laughing. And I did some other things that I describe in the book that people start labeling me and no, persona non grata. So I'm going to emphasize two things that changed my life totally in the village. One day I saw all these people walking to the church, and was Easter week. And the Thursday is the holiest day in the Catholic religion. So I said to myself, well, all these people are rushing to church. I'm going to see what is happening there. So I went there and escaped from the house. My mother didn't see me. And I went inside the church and was packed with people. And I made pushing people. I made my way in. I don't care. It was Indian mestizos. I got to the front of the main altar, and I saw the priest giving to all the children that I knew from the village in the school. I saw them getting a cookie from the priest, and I said, well, I want a cookie too. And I said, like a little tortilla, white cookie. And I went and I opened my mouth, and the priest gave me the soap, and mine was a cookie, and was the sacred host. And when the kids saw me doing that one, they said, oh my God, you didn't have the confession. It's a sin, it's a mortal sin. Don't swallow. All the kids started screaming at me, and I got all confused, and I spit the sacred host on the floor because I didn't know what to do. So, oh God, the congregation was stunned, was so shocked that they didn't know what to say, what to do. So the priest said, let's pray for him because this child doesn't know what he's doing and he needs help. Let's help praying for him so he would change, eventually will change in his life. And it's good for him to pray. And I went to my house and I got there. And by that time, my father knew. My father didn't find a whip. So he just took his machete and with the blade hit me. I mean, really hit me so bad that then I couldn't sleep. But my mother put some banana leaves in the bag so I could rest. That was it. But then the people start bullying more and some kind of ostracism took place there. But that passed. I think the villagers start accepting me again. They told me what I wanted to buy, meat or vegetables, some eggs. One day was the month of December, I remember. And this city has a church and they celebrate the nativity, the birth of baby Jesus, and there is a sponsor in the village who pay for all the festivity in her house. And they kill a cow, they kill a pig, they bake bread, so the whole village practically goes there to eat and to celebrate the born of baby Jesus. And one of the committees lady came to my house and said to my mother to let me go and sing to the baby Jesus that night and with other kids. And she said, no, my son won't behave. I don't want my son to go. I won't permit him to go. And the woman said, I will control him. I will take care of him. I will take him and bring him back. And my mother said, but what condition? Okay, so that night I went to church, and from church all the kids went parading and singing on the way to the house of the madrina. And the program started at 11 o'clock at night, and we ate, we drank sodas, lemonade, hibiscus soda, rice soda, bread, and everything else. You know, I was very hungry all the time. So then the program started singing to the baby Jesus, and the madrina came and gave to each child one sparkling light, but she didn't give me one. And I said, maybe because I'm Indian or what, you know? So the kids around me, they bully me, say, oh, you didn't get one, and they ignore you. And so I've never seen that phenomenon that you grab a sparkling and all the fire goes all over your hand. And I said, I had to have that experience, you know? So I went there and I said to one of the kids, can you lend me one for one moment? And he said, no, and the other kid, no, and I saw the sparkling lights getting burned, you know? And I look on my side, there was this angel with paper mache wings, and I hit the angel in the arm, and she dropped the sparkling light. And the sawdust that they painted to simulate the countryside of Jerusalem was a sawdust and got burned. And then the wings of the angel got burned. I took them off, and the altar caught on fire, and the whole activity on fire. I could hear the cracking of the old toys and mirrors simulating the lakes. And somebody said, save Jesus, save the baby Jesus. And one guy in the fire, he got up and grabbed a tray, silver tray where the baby Jesus was. And everybody was crying. Everybody was just, I mean, very surprised about what is happening. And the bell started ringing, tragedy, and the house was burned, and another house was burned, and so on and so on. Some people were saying that 10 houses were burned, and some other people said 16 houses. I mean, you know, everything was so drama that I was very confused, and then all the kids got together and we went marching with the baby Jesus and the Madrina crying, and practically everybody was crying, and we marched on the way to church. And happened to be that the house of the Madrina was at the end of the main street in the village, which there is only one main street, and we had to go almost crossing town. So when we arrived to the square, there were many, many people there, you know, in pajamas. The climate is kind of humid, so some of them, they didn't have shirts. I just look at what happened, somebody crying. I said, the baby Jesus was born. And they said, who born it? And they said, Federico, the son of Juan Jiménez. That is the first time I heard my name connected to the tragedy. And when we arrived to the church, the priest blessed the baby Jesus and the Madrina, and then the service started. And the woman took me home, and the next day, my father woke me up, and again, he beat me until he didn't have more energy to do that. So that was something that the village really didn't want to take. So there were rumors that I was excommunicated to the 5th generation. I said to my mother, what is that? And my mother said, well, you are a sinner and your children were sinners. And it's sinners, the children of the children. I said that it's very confusing and convoluted to know. And she said, I said, what can I do? He said, the Holy Father is the only one who can forgive you. So I said, well, I have to write a letter to the Holy Father. And she said, no, you have to go in person. He will bless you and he will send you to Jerusalem, and you have to walk in Via Dolorosa. And you had to pray in every station, and that was the end of your sin. So the time passed, but that was the most extraordinary ostracism. The things got so bad for me that the doctor of the town one night went to my house and so nobody would see him, and told my father to get me out of the village because I was in danger. So his sister had a friend who knew the director of the boarding school for military kids, and I should be there. The discipline was very good. So my father said, okay. So 2 weeks later, they had the money to buy the ticket. And I remember my father borrowed 2 horses. And he put me in one, and I was in the other one. Nobody, it was supposed to be a secret. Nobody knew that I was leaving town. When we passed the river where all these people go to bathe and wash themselves, the kids saw me on the way to the airport, and they started screaming, oh, the evil is going, the devil is going, the wreck boy is coming, and even they gathered these rocks and started screaming at me, and my father beat the horses, and we went to the airport. We got at the airport, and a plane landed, 22 passengers plane. My father took his red handkerchief and cleaned my shoes, and he gave me a big hug. Very tight, but he blew it because I remember him telling me in my ear, don't come back soon, don't come back soon. These people don't like you, don't come back soon, because if you come back soon, I have to send you to the next village forever, and was hard. So I got in the plane and I saw my father in the little window, and I saw him raising his hand, saying goodbye, but actually I thought that he was saying, don't come back, don't come back. So 45 minutes later, I arrived in this big city of Oaxaca, and I took the shuttle and I went to my sponsor, and in 5 minutes, she said, let's go to the boarding school. We got to the boarding school, she registered me, and I was number 452. I didn't have a name, just the number. My uniforms, everything was marked with my number. So I was the first night in my life that I slept in a bed, and I was getting a condition to the boarding school, following all the rules and regulations there. So they have a clinic, and the doctor called me, and I had to be clear to be mingled with the other kids. So he checked me, and I took my clothes off and checked me, the heart, the stomach, everything. And when he got to my head, he said, oh my God, oh my God. And like he saw something terrible. Oh my God, you know. How long have you been here? I said, 2 weeks. Oh, my children. Oh, how many you infected? Oh, God, I can't believe. And called the nurse. He said, take this child out of this kid out of here immediately. So the nurse got my little bags in the dormitory and put me on the street. Took me to security, and security put me out. And I said, what am I going to do? I don't know anybody in the city. And I walked to my sponsor, and she said, well, I can't have you here. You are infected. I have 3 children here. So I walked to the Zocalo, and I sat there, and I said, I don't know what to do. And I was getting hungry and was getting a little bit late. And I remember that in my packet, I have a address that this couple gave me when they went to the village to a festival to sell fabrics, and I was helping them. And I said, one day I go to Oaxaca, I'm going to visit you. But you know, I never thought, or they never thought I was going to do that. So I started walking to that address, and the door was open, and I walked, and I saw these little rooms, you know, where people live. It was like a compound, and I didn't have to knock the door. I saw them, and I said, you know, I came from Tututepec, and I want you to give me a place to stay. She said, I don't have a place. We lived in this bedroom. The only thing I have is little room where we storage all the pieces of wood that we use in the market to sell fabric. I said, it's fine with me. I slept in mat in the village. It's fine. So then I have to think how to make money to cure myself. So this infection that I have in my head. So I went to downtown, and I started asking for a job in the market, you know, to sell apples and all things. And the guy said, go to sell newspapers. So I went to the newspaper, and I put my name, and the owner said, I only can give you 20 papers because I don't know you. So I was making 5 centavos in paper, 2 pesos in the morning. Anyway, I got some money to buy my medicine in the market. My sponsor was giving some vitamins because I was anemic also. So I lost all my hair because the treatment was brutal. They put me DDT, some people, they put me sulfur. And about 3 months later, but before I went in full time, my sponsor went, I spoke to the director of the boarding school to let me go in the daytime only to the classrooms, not to mingle with the kids. So after 3 months, I was fine, and I went, the doctor cleared me, and I went full time to the boarding school. The last month in the boarding school. They have a ceremony to Benito Juarez and the University of Oaxaca. And I went marching with like a little soldier with other kids, and we sat there and I saw the speaker, how eloquent he was, how to celebrate the life of Benito Juarez. And I said to one of the kids, I'm going to come here to study. And he said, this is for rich, not for Indian, poor Indian. I said, Benito Juarez was an Indian, was poor and was discriminated like me. And he was apothec, but I'm mistake. So I finished school and I went and I registered there in the school. And I asked for what was the profession that was shorter, and they told me the assistant of an accounting. I said, fine. So the first 2 weeks I studied the environment, and there were 3 ladies who helped me, and there are three professors. The first one I approached and I said to her, you know, you have something for me to do in your house. I will be very happy to do. I need to work. And she said, oh, yes, I'm catering weddings, and I want you to wash the 3 patios of my house because I have guests from the United States also. And every Saturday, she paid me 5 pesos, and I went and I washed the 3 patios very well with soap and everything. So one day I was talking to this old man, probably in his 75 or 80, and he spoke fluently Spanish, but the conversation continued every time I saw him. And one day he says to me, I'm going back to the United States, to Ocala, Florida, and I will ask the congregation of the Anglican Church to see if they can give you a scholarship. I really didn't believe that. And suddenly a month later, he says to me, you are going to get $20 a month, and you have to study the shorter career. And I said, yes, 4 years. For 4 years, you are going to get $20. Oh, I was so happy because I moved to my own room. I paid $50 for the room, and I had the other, 50 pesos, and I have 200 pesos to eat and buy books and clothes. But that didn't last too long because my mother came to visit me. And she saw the market full for food and meat and vegetables. And then she said we had to come because we are starving in the village. So of course, one day they arrived, everybody, my 5 brothers and my sister and my mother and my father, and we were in one room. So the landlord didn't like that one. So we moved to another and moved to the third little apartment. So everything was fine, but I need to work for the family. They have to go to school and clothing. And so I went and I said, I had to approach another professor. So I approached her and she said, what can I do for you? And I said, I want you to baptize my little brother in the cathedral. And she said, I will ask my husband. And the husband said yes. The husband was a federal judge, dependency from the Supreme Court. And so my mother made tamales to celebrate the baptism. And when the judge was eating tamales, my mother said, you have to find a job for my son Federico because we need more money and we really can't afford to do anything. And the judge said, I don't have anything, but when I get a vacancy, I will think of you. The only thing that I have right now is somebody to clean the toilets. And my mother said, my son Federico can do that. And when you get a better job, you will give it to him. And so I was cleaning toilets from the federal building. And one day the judge says to me, there is a vacancy come. And the union almost killed me because I jumped 14 years of seniority. But the judge said, don't worry, you are a private assistant. And he really took me in his wings like a son because he never had one. And he confined everything, a lot of things to me and some of the secrets. And I accompanied him to Mexico City to the Supreme Court. And I met the first woman minister of the Supreme Court in the history of Mexico, Maria Cristina Salmoran de Tamayo. And at the second time, I paid a visit to her also in the Supreme Court because the judge took me there carrying the papers and the briefcase so he could see the president of the Supreme Court. So I was mingling with other people. He really wanted to be a Supreme Court minister, but he never made it. I was very bright, but then, I mentioned a couple of things of heavy-duty cases that he had. That for that reason, we went to the Supreme Court to talk to the president, or the Supreme Court, of course, and they are in my book. So then I was making enough money to survive, and so one day I was writing. Was this other woman who helped me? People were criticizing me for my accent and my costeño accent and my Mixtec accent. So when I registered in a class, that the woman said to me, the professor says to me, "You are very bad. Your body language is no good. Your accent is no good. Your mimic is no good. Your voice is no good. Your temperament is no good. Your eloquence is no good." I said, "I need help." So anyway, she said, "I'm taking you because I want to do something with you, but I demand a lot of discipline." I said, "Fine." So she taught me how to speak. I got rid of the accents. I practiced diction until finally I graduated and I made my debut in public talking. I didn't know how to talk in public, so she taught me what to do, and she was very happy. And she was the head of a newspaper, and she taught me how to write articles. When one day I was writing an article about the medicine in the market, and somebody saw me there in the market, and was an anthropologist from UCLA, and the science department at UCLA allocated some money to study system marketing, the Valley of Oaxaca, and he was part of it. And he introduced me to other anthropologists, and they said, "Do you want to work for the group?" And I said, "No, because I'm making good money." I said, they said, "How much are you making?" 2,500 pesos a month. He said, "Would you like to double that?" So I asked the judge, and the judge said, "Go. And I give you 6 months. In 6 months, you don't want the job, come back." So I went there, and in one party, I met my wife, Ellen. And Ellen came to the United States, and I stayed there to be graduated. And I got my bachelor's degree at the university, and I followed her. When I got to the United States, the United States was in disarray, People were protesting the Vietnam War, the civil rights, the women's liberation, the gay liberation, the Indian movement, the Chicano power. There were the hippie movement. There was really incredibly energy there. I happened to be that behind the house where Ellen lived, there was the headquarters of the Indian movement. So I went to Dennis Bank and Russell Green, and I said, that I wanted to participate with them because I'm an Indian from Oaxaca. So they gave me a poster that is behind me that said, "Americans, love it or give it back." But it was very hard to put all the Indians together in the county of Los Angeles because some of them, they live in Riverside, in Pomona, Santa Barbara. So one day they disintegrated because I made contact with the bodyguard of Dennis Bank, was a very handsome, tall, very big Indian. Reminds me of that Indian that was flying over the cuckoo nest, and his name was Doug. And I talked to him many times, and it happened to be that he was the FBI informant. So the group of disintegrated, they left, and it was a shame because Buffy Sainte-Marie was doing concerts to raise money for the movement, and also there were Bob Dylan and other artists wouldn't cooperate. But one day Marlon Brando gave me a check to buy some turquoise necklace for the staff. And, you know, there was a lot of energy there, but and they left. So then I went to the Safeway market and I saw these people marching and protesting, and was the union farmers that Cesar Chavez was the head of that. And I went there and they gave me my poster of Cesar Chavez, which is also on my left, and a union poster that is given to important people. I got one, which is behind me. And so I was protesting there with the movement, and I was in the supermarket, Marina del Rey in Los Angeles, making $1.29 an hour, part-time, and mingling with people who were protesting. Ellen was with the Women's Liberation, and in the weekends we went to the Berkeley moratoriums, and then I got a job in a factory, which I really didn't like at all working in a factory. Even if they were paying me $3 an hour, quality control inspectors inspecting parts for the airplanes, dependency from Douglas Corporation. And in my break or lunch time, I will start drawing things, and I have several paintings like this one, and to me were the tonas, you know. And I showed it to my classmates in Venice High School, and they offered me $5 each painting, and I was selling. So I quit the factory, and I was driving in West Hollywood, and I saw a flea market, and I said to Ellen, let's see it. So I went there, and the following weekend, I was there with my card table. There is a picture to prove it. My first day in business, and a Japanese took that picture, and a year later he gave it to me. And then from there, mentioned in my book how I got to Montana Avenue, and I rented 2,000 square feet a gallery there, $9,600 a month. But I have the place there full with merchandise, Mexican folk art, American folk art, and the people were buying all those things. You know, merchandise was the problem. A lot of people from the movie sets came and bought things from me that I mentioned some in the book. But so then I started promoting the art of my art, celebrating my culture. So I brought painters and artists from Mexico, from Oaxaca, from Tasco, and I'm responsible for really being able to push these prices of the Mexican silver, because Mexican silver people didn't like it. They prefer American Indians silver. So in that time, for example, I was selling a bracelet for $45, and now that bracelet from Mexico, made by the masters, brings $4,000. You know, I'm the responsible for celebrating that prices and that my culture. You know, I was a little bit ethnocentric about being seeing the American Indian jewelry so expensive and the Mexican so cheap. So anyway, in my gallery, I have a lot of exhibitions from artists from New Mexico also. And in that time, I was looking for a place to open a museum to celebrate my Mexican culture. And Antonio Hernandez, head of the MALDAF, invited me to be in the board of MALDAF. MALDAF is Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Funds. And I was there in the educational department. And I found my first assignment was to raise money for 40 students that they were lawyers, and they needed $2,000 to graduate, and they didn't have the money, and they couldn't borrow money because they were undocumented. So that was my first thing, my first assignment, and we did it. And what I was doing is fundraising money for the students in Malta. And I love Malta because it's one of the most powerful organizations in the country, very powerful, and has to do with civil rights, with discrimination, with immigration. We went a couple of times to see the Gortari when he was president of Mexico. So then in that time also I left Malta, then I was invited to be in the Miles and Rogers Museum in New Mexico for 4 years as a trustee, and then I was in the Southwest Museum, the oldest museum in Los Angeles, and I was there for more than 25 years, and we merged to the Atri National Center, which I was already in the board also, so I'm still in the board. Ellen, my wife, and I still in the board of the Atri Museum. Then I decided that all the objects that we collected in 50 years, traveling all over the world practically, because we went to 28 countries. I love the Middle East and Latin America, Peru, Chile. And wherever we brought, our house becomes like a museum. So we decided to have a museum in Oaxaca. And we looked for a place, but finally we found a place. And guess what? It was the house where I was washing the 3 patios. That is my museum, and that is my property that I own it. Coincidentally, in my life, you're going to find in the book a lot of coincidences that I don't know how that happened. But my main thing, I said I live in Los Angeles. I had to find a place to celebrate my culture in Los Angeles. Every ethnic group in Los Angeles has a museum, the Chinese, the Italians, the Japanese, the Blacks. Why can't we have a museum? So many people, Mexican people in Los Angeles. So I started exploring the possibility when Antonio Hernandez and we went from one place and another one, and we never got together. Mexicans sometimes are difficult to put them together. So finally, Supervisor Gloria Molina allocated $38 million to retro 2 buildings right in the center of Los Angeles. That was the place that we always wanted. And then we opened La Plaza de Cultura y Arte is the name of it. And I was very, very happy to be one of the founders. And we celebrate the Antonio Villaraigosa was the first mayor, Latino mayor, after 150 years. And I was asked to put the award to him, which there is a picture. And also I presented the award to Linda Ronstein because she was celebrating the music of my country. And I'm very, very happy that the ambassador of the United States, the Mexican ambassador in the United States, came to visit La Plaza. And so I feel wonderful that finally we had a place to celebrate the 44 people who were the founders, Latino, Mexican founders of Los Angeles. And then I dedicated my time to my museum in Oaxaca, and we opening, and we gave it to the city of Oaxaca. So Oaxaca has a new museum, and that is my baby. And what we did is to put to the history of the jewelry, because I'm a designer of jewelry, so pre-Columbian jewelry, colonial jewelry, and contemporary. And then the history of the customs, the Indian customs. And proudly, I will say that my grandfather costume that my grandmother wore is there in the collection of the textile collection at my museum. And for me, it's really more important, like I have an obligation, very profoundly, is to keep helping children. Because I was a very poor kid, I do and have been doing, and I will do until I die, programs for children and helping them. And now, a friend of mine who was the head of Casa Cultural in East Los Angeles died. So now part of the proceeds of this book, I'm going to give it to them because we have to continue. We don't want to close that cultural center. More or less, I have been married 53 years and with Ellen, the love of my life, and in April, we will be 54 years. And my family is very well connected. We own a clinic, my brother owned a clinic in Oaxaca. All the tools came from Houston, Texas. And my sister retired being a judge, and I have a dentist, I have a radiologist, and I have another lawyer brother, and I have my little brother is a art dealer and antiques and folk art. That is what has been done and what I have been done in my life. And I thank you very much for listening to me. And I hope I conveyed some information that you can use. And now I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Federico and Shelby, for your presentation today. And we talked a little bit about this last week, but I think it would be great if you could talk about the nature of your village. It's very hard for somebody to think about what 1940s in a village in Oaxaca is like. And I have a modern context to Oaxaca, and you know, these are extreme conditions that you were living in, and I was wondering, in Shelby or Federico, either one of you may speak to just what these conditions were truly like that you came out of.
Federico, well, first of all, I think I mentioned at the very beginning, at the time that Federico was growing up, there were no roads into Tututepec. They were mostly just like, you know, little lanes, primarily for animals to, you know, horses and donkeys and things like that to come in.
Right.
And the town was basically dependent on agriculture, and really it was, in terms of the economy, it was more of a subsistence economy. And Federico, I think you could add more to that in terms of what kinds of things were being grown and traded and so on.
Somebody has another question?
Did you want to talk more about just kind of what kinds of plants were grown, what you harvested there in terms of trading and so on?
Well, you are right. There was only a trail to the airport, a trail to other villages. Everything was carried by plane. And from the airport was carrying mules or donkeys to the downtown, and the business where the business dealers were the really ones that made that hard for the people to. They didn't want the highway in the first place because that will affect their business. In one way, probably because will be a lot of competition and things will be cheaper, but I don't know. That is one thing. And they were rich and poor, you know, and the poor were poor. And the Indians, you know, to be at that time, at that moment, to be Indian and to be poor, you know, I'm not being able to really name your own mayor in the city because you are an Indian, you couldn't vote, you know. And, and now, being a woman, being an Indian, and being poor, for example, they, you know, was horrible. We only have mayors, mestizos mayor for everything, you know. So, and they kind of recognize that they shouldn't mix with us because all the ceremonies and all the celebration traditionally that the Indians have in the village were done by the Indians, and the mestizos never mingle with Indians to celebrate anything like the rainy season, the harvesting, you know, all those things were done. They took the saint, the main saint, the Indians to in procession to the pre-Columbian place and to pray for water. And I was really very surprised that the day they took the saint to pray to ask for rained that day. And I remember in that house, that dark house that my grandfather had, there were some baskets and some documents there, and they decide what day they would take the main saint to that big hill. You know, it's a big hill with big rock on the top of the hill, and they put the saint all the way on the top of the rock. And they were praying for rain, and it didn't rain that day. They repeat the same thing, and sometimes they had to arrive and ask for room for the saint in the first house because that pre-Columbian place where they took the saint was out of the village. So the first house has to protect the saint from the rain. And there were a lot of magic in the village that, as so in the community, in the Indian community, you know, it's just happening. And how I remember my my mother telling me things about the Indians, but in the most despective way that I don't know why my mother married my father, but I wish I asked her more, because my mother, for example, told me I said, tell me about, I need more information about how my grandmother was curing people. And then she said, she was a bruja, she was a witch. And she said, I had to tell you one thing that I saw, for example, and nobody can lie to me, my mother said. One day we went to Juquila Fair. One comadre of your grandmother got sick in the stomach and temperature, and they said, and she complained to your grandmother, oh, Nabora, I'm sick, I don't feel good. And then she said, evil eye, somebody did something bad to you, but I'm going to cure you. And we arrived to Juquila, the woman was in pain, and so then she has contacts my grandmother with people there, and they gave a bed, and this Indian companion was lying in bed, and then she asked for a gourd made out of clay from the house where they arrived. And then in the charcoal, she put dried chilies and the gourd made out of clay, and she put charcoal, burning charcoal inside. Of course, the smoke coming out there could kill you, you know. And then they put the sick person to smell that fume that was coming from the gourd. And my grandmother was holding her from the back, touching the stomach. And she said, you have something in your stomach. Somebody did something bad to you. And you have to get that out of the stomach. And like magic, you know, do it again. And the woman was sneezing and sneezing and sneezing, and my grandmother said more and more and more and more. So finally, the woman almost passed out. And my grandmother, that's according to my mother, saw a little frog. Said, "This is what you have in your stomach. Can you see this? This is what they put you in the stomach. Now, from now on, you are going to be well." And my mother said, "This witch, we crossed many rivers. When she approached to your grandmother that she was sick, she knew how to do that. So she probably grabbed the little frog and put it in the bucket, and that was the cure. This is what, and you know what?" And I said, "Mother, and the Indian got well?" She said, "Yes, she got well." I said, "Well, she was a healer." No, she was a bruja. That tells you what environment I was, my childhood was, you know. So, and they respected my grandmother because when we went to the river, there was a little, a little well, and that water was the best in the river. So the Indians were lying with the gourds, you know, like 4 or 5 Indians were waiting to get our water from that little well. And when they saw my grandmother arriving, everybody went on the side and let my grandmother help herself. So that was a respect, because she was a healer. She was a magician, probably, no? And the people were afraid or respect one or two. But I feel that I'm glad that people didn't like me in my village. I'm here to tell this story, you know, because if I stay there with my donkey, I don't know what will happen.
We have a question, Judith Rocky, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and she's asking a question that a couple of people have had.
Hey.
Judith, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really honored to hear your story. I was wondering, have you visited Tututepec since you left as a child? And do you know if any of those bullies are aware, or do they know what your story is, what you've accomplished since you left?
You know, I went to Tututepec probably 10 years later, but I went as an incognito. I didn't show my face, only an eye. I went to the streets with another friend, I think. And so they didn't realize that I was there, and I haven't been there since that, okay? But my sister went last year, and my sister went to see an aunt of mine. She probably is about 94 years old. And my aunt told my sister, "Tell Lico," they call me Federico, they call me Lico, "tell Lico that he didn't burn the baby Jesus. It was an accident that I said by saying I forgive him or something like that. You know? But still, all people remember that. I said to my sister, "Thank you for telling me that." You know, I thought that everybody forgot. This has been so many years, you know, but that what happened.
We have
a question.
We have another question, Jeff Yamauchi, I believe. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask, he's asking about the tonal, I think.
Oh yeah! Wow, what a life. Can you elaborate more on that talk about tonal? I've never heard of that concept before. Thank you.
He's talking about the concept of the tonal.
Yes.
And I didn't catch either. What is your tonal?
That I know what my tona is. I know what animal is, but it's no. It's a secret for life. Gotcha. My mother asked me one day. She didn't know, and she said, "I don't care, but for curiosity, did your grandfather knew what your tona is. What is it? And I said, Mother, why are you asking me that question? You know that I cannot tell you that. So the tonal is, there are probably a couple of books. I don't remember, I think a social anthropologist describes something like that, but they call tona or nawart. I think probably there was a writer who published books in the time when I came to the United States, Carlos Castañeda, the one who published the Teaching of Don Juan. Probably I think he mentioned something about the Nawart. Some groups they call Nawart and some groups call Tona. So I should look for it. I would like to go back to Tututepec and write more about the Tona and about the Black people, because those groups lived in the coast. And I want to tell the story of the Black people. My father was mingling with the Black people. I remember arriving to the village to sell smoked fish, and several Black families came. And you can sleep in the patio because, or the houses, because the climate allowed to do that. So the Blacks were there for the horses or donkeys, where they carry their fish to sell it in the fair of the village. And that is another project that I had to see if I can get to Tututepec. The reason I haven't been in Tututepec because my wife I'm 80 years old and my wife is 90. And she has a lot of arthritis and she's in the wheelchair. So I don't want to leave her for a moment. So, and she can now travel to the village, unfortunately. I mean, I can make her, but it won't be, although I find that it's not possible. I was there last year, and I happened to know the security of the governor, the new governor. And we were having lunch one day, and one of my assistant there says to me, Federico wants to go to the village, and the head of the security said to me, why don't you go? I said, because my wife's in the wheelchair. He said, we will take it. I can borrow the jet from the governor and take you to Puerto Escondido, and then to Tututepec is 40 minutes in the car. And I said, no, it's too much for my wife. And then he said, well, we will take you in the jet. And from there, we borrow also the helicopters to go to the village. And then his secretary, sergeant, whatever it said, and where are we going to land the helicopter? And the head of the security said, in this place, and said, Comandante, we can't do that because that place belongs to the cartel. And then I said, you know what? Thank you. No. Thank you very much for your wishes. We will leave that way. So, but I'm trying to go to Tututepec now and see everything. And maybe I'll take Shelby one day when we can, to do and walk everything, where things happen.
So in regard to the tonal, and Shelby, if you have more to add to that, let me know. But I'm aware of it through modern wood carvers in Oaxaca. Talk about the tonal. They're like their spiritual guides that are assigned to them at birth based on their birth and is it the Nahuatl calendar? Do you know, Shelby, how that works?
No, I'm not sure how it relates to the Nahuatl calendar, but my understanding is that as Federico was saying, when his mother asked what his tona was, he's not permitted to tell. I mean, this is a very personal thing, and it's not something that you share with anyone outside of your immediate culture or family. So it's very important. I think with it's kind of like a spiritual guide, and And whatever your tona is often reflected in your personality. And there is a story, interesting story in the book about this flood that occurred, and how this individual's tona had left this person's body, and that the person was dying because the tona had left and was growing inside this pond and creating a lot of havoc. So it's a very, very interesting story about the tona in Federico's book.
But also there are in Guadalajara, Tlatepaque, they made tonales, which is made of ceramic. They are old and new ones, but there are a lot of people collect them because they have the mask. The animal has a mask on that. And I have one, it's not an old one, but it's a beautiful carving from, this is a representation of a tonal. Okay, can you see it? Can Scott see it?
Yes, yes.
This is it, you know, the face, and they call tonales. Right? And my museum has some in ceramic from Tlatepaque. I remember the antique dealers in Madero Street in Mexico City, they used to specialize in those tonas. And so we have some in the museum. But it's something that has to be studied more profoundly, you know. And the information that I have is just what my mother gave it to me. And I'm glad that she did it in a way that wasn't wasn't biased, you know. She just told me what the Indians were doing, and the Indians did this one, and the Indians that one, you know. And you are going to read in my book the eclipse also. That is very important. When my mother was pregnant, an eclipse took place. Oh, that was a really heavy duty also, no, Shelby?
It certainly was.
And maybe Shelby, you want to talk about sort of, you know, we obviously had only 50 minutes for a presentation today, and there's a lot in this book. If you want to talk a little bit about sort of the different aspects that are people would be really interested in reading more about.
Yeah, you know, Federico told you about the story of his birth, and that his mother had already lost two sons at childbirth. And he was just mentioning the story of the eclipse. And I have to say, this was one of the first stories that Federico told me one night when we were having dinner. And to me, this was just so magical and mystical. And during a lunar eclipse, this happened in October 1940. And his mother was pregnant, probably about not quite 6 months yet, but during the eclipse, it's a dangerous time for people in the village, especially the indigenous people, the Mixtec. And so children need to be protected, animals need to be protected from the lunar eclipse. But most of all, unborn children, what they do with unborn children is they cover the stomach of the pregnant woman with a red cloth, and that is what protects the unborn child. and during a lunar eclipse in Tututepec, it is the time when the moon and the sun are fighting. And so all the villagers come out, and they're making all kinds of noise, banging pans and everything else during this fight between the moon and the sun during this eclipse. And so it's something taken very seriously, and is understood to have some really dire effects if you don't take care of your animals and your children, and especially the unborn. And I thought, when he first told me that story, I just thought, oh my gosh, this is a story that has to be told. And then when he was telling me about the story of his birth and all the mysticism and magic and someone that was involved in this birth. To me, I just had never heard anything like it. And I think probably one of the most important aspects of this whole story is it's not an anthropologist. It's not me telling the story of this person. It's Federico telling the story of his own life and all the emotion that's involved in telling that story. And I think that's what makes this book so unique. It's told from the Emic perspective, if you know what, and not from, the observer anthropologist. And that's what makes that book so special, I think.
The other thing is, Shelby, you remember how my mother told me how the funeral of my grandfather.
Oh, yeah.
That story also is my mother told me that is the way they were, and the Indians, but that really is very, very interesting way that a principal was buried, and it's a lot of pre-Columbian custom took place there, because at the end, to be buried with a black live dog, that was something that drew me. My mother told me, how they bury, how they put what they put in the tomb was really something that has to be read. That story of the funeral I got my eyes when my mother was telling me about that.
Well, sadly, our hour and a half has come and gone, and I think we could probably spend another hour and a half talking. And this book sounds amazing, and I put the details in the chat again. It's Federico, One Man's Remarkable Journey from Tututepec to Los Angeles. He's got his fresh copy. It just came from the printer, and it is available for order on the U of A Press website, and all of that is in your link. And they have a 30% discount off the book and any of the other U of A Press books. But we want to thank you both so much for your part in bringing this story and preserving these stories. And I think this will go a long way for helping people understand your incredible journey and the unique culture, not just of Mexico, but of Oaxaca, which is just such an intense place on itself. So thank you both so much. And you have any parting words?
I would say to all the kids that in Mexico and Tututepec and all the villages, like Cesar Chavez, when he gave me this record, said, "Sí se puede," and I was really thrilled to be part of to all this history. It's amazing how it's not because it's my life, but the things that happen is. Okay. So
it reminds me of Forrest Gump of Mexico. You've touched on so many amazing, but yours is real. Yours is a real story. And you've touched on so many amazing parts of our history in the United States and in Mexico, and it truly is a wonder. Yeah.
Well, I will just close with, this has been truly a wonderful collaboration and such an honor to work on this book with Federico. And it is truly his story. As the editor, I didn't change his story in any way, shape, or form. And it was a real honor to work with Federico in helping him tell his story. So, and I want to thank Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for hosting us today. It's really been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank everybody for joining us, and we'll be back next week on Monday for our wonderful session at 1 o'clock, same time, and again, a second one on Wednesday next week. So make sure you're signed up for those. Federico and Shelby, thank you again so much, and everybody have a wonderful week at OLLI, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.